Good evening, and thank you for joining us for tonight's Live from the Library program. My name is Kathleen Odney, and I'm a member of the Walnut Creek Library Foundation Board, and thank you for coming out to tonight's program with Dr. Wayne Wiegand. I want to extend a special thanks to our live program sponsors, Friends of the Walnut Creek Library, Minuteman Press in Lafayette, and the East Bay Times. As a reminder, please turn off your cell phones. We would very much appreciate that courtesy. Or silence them, please. Tonight, we are very excited to have a local resident and celebrated author, Dr. Wayne Wiegand, to hear him talk about his book, Part of Our Lives, A People's History of the American Public Library, which delves into the history and the heart of why Americans love their libraries. He presents a philosophy about public libraries and their responsibilities to fight censorship and defend intellectual freedom, and demonstrates that since the late 19th century, American public libraries have created community. He is often referred to as the Dean of American Librarian Historians. Dr. Wiegand is a Florida State University F. William Summers Emeritus Professor of Library and Information Science Studies. He received a BA in History at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, an MA in History at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, a Master's of Library Science at Western Michigan University, and a PhD in History at Southern Illinois University. Your Midwest credentials are impeccable. He served as a historical consultant for Free for All, Inside the Public Library, a documentary on the American Public Library that will be released this spring, and is currently working on a history of American public school librarianship. Dr. Wiegand's book, Part of Our Lives, will be available for sale and signing immediately following tonight's program. We are celebrating the 10th anniversary of the opening of this wonderful library this year. So make sure to sign up for our newsletters as we are planning special community celebrations throughout the year. Our next live program, The Life of Robert Noble Burgess with author James Moore, will be held on February 12th, so don't forget to pick up a flyer or sign up on the sheet outside. And make sure to connect with the Walnut Creek Library Foundation on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, as we will be sharing some pictures after tonight's event. Now, please help me to welcome to the stage Dr. Wayne Wiegand.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you for having me. Yes, I come from the Midwest, and I bleed green and gold. Guess who I'm rooting for? I have a huge goal here today to persuade you to broaden your thinking about libraries in general and what public libraries accomplish for their users in particular. I'm motivated in large part because of conclusions that emerged from research on a book published 4 years ago entitled Part of Our Lives, A People's History of the American Public Library. My goal in that book was to find out historically why people have loved these ubiquitous civic institutions. And love them they do. A 1916 report by the Pew Research Internet and American Life Project noted that in the previous decade, every other major institution, government, churches, banks, corporation, has fallen in public esteem except librarians, the military, and first responders. The study also found that 91% of those surveyed over 16 years old said libraries were important to their communities. 98% identified their public library experiences as positive. Another Pew study found 94% of parents believe libraries are important for their children. 84% said because libraries develop a love of reading and books. In my historical narrative, I didn't take the conventional user in the life of the library approach. Rather, I took a library in the life of the user perspective because I wanted to trace the history of the public library, not so much by analyzing the words of its founders and managers, but mostly by listening to the voices of people who use them since the middle of the 19th century. Thus, instead of a top-down view, part of our lives adopts a bottom-up perspective that features the voices of generations of public library users. Largely because of recent technologies, uncovering many of these voices was not difficult. Time-consuming, yes, but not difficult. Some are published in memoirs, autobiographies, and biographies of the famous, some in manuscript collections and archives across the country. The vast majority, however, are fixed in thousands of U.S. newspapers and periodicals digitized since the 1990s into huge databases. By using public library as a search term, I found thousands of voices in letters to the editors, thousands more quoted in stories reporters wrote about local libraries. And as I analyzed this data, I was surprised at how quickly it organized into three main categories. In no particular order, people have loved their public libraries. We're going to test this now. There we go. For the useful information they made accessible, for the public spaces they provided, and for the transformative potential of commonplace reading they circulated that helped users make sense of their worlds. First, a few historical anecdotes comfortably fitting the category of information as we currently define it in library and information studies. When sitting in a Cincinnati public library desk in 1867, Thomas Edison compiled a bibliography on electricity. A colleague later recalled, many times Edison would get excused from duty under pretense of being too sick to work, and invariably strike a beeline for the library, where he'd spend the entire day and evening reading such works on electricity as were to be had. In 1899, Wilbur and Orville Wright came upon an ornithology book in the Dayton Public Library that rekindled their interest in human flight, one of their biographers notes. In a Detroit public library reading room in the 1950s, a teenage female pored over comedians' printed monologues. She appeared in short monodramas written by herself without makeup and hardly any props, Lily Tomlin's biographer later noted, conjuring up not only the personality of the character she portrayed, but also of the unseen people with whom she was talking. About the same time in Hot Springs, Arkansas, 10-year-old William Jefferson Clinton discovered the Garland County Public Library. I would go there for hours browsing among the books, especially those on Native Americans. In 1971, 10-year-old Barack Obama returned to Honolulu from Jakarta. First place I wanted to be was in a library, he later recalled. Often he had a special information need. One Saturday, with the help of a raspy-voiced old librarian who appreciated my seriousness, I found a book on East Africa. Obama wanted information about Kenya, birthplace of his father, a Luo tribe member. The Luo raised cattle and lived in mud huts and ate cornmeal and yams and something called millet, the book said. Their traditional costume was a leather thong across the crotch. Shocked by what he read, Obama left the book open-faced on the table and walked out without thanking the librarian. All these people had information needs an American public library met, and the anecdotes I've read nicely fit the traditional discourse of library and information studies profession that focuses primarily on information. In many respects, a professional discourse functions like a big intellectual sandbox, plenty of room to play with ideas, but one nonetheless with limits, a social boundary, if you will, in which the profession's leaders employ a formal way of thinking to educate and enlighten members who then implement what they learn to improve professional service for the public's greater benefit. For librarians, that translates into services they institute and maintain, and collections, spaces, and resources they make accessible. For most of its history, librarianship's discourse has focused on what in the 18th century was called useful knowledge, in the 19th and 20th century called best reading. That's a phrase that's still in the American Library Association's official motto. and in the late 20th morphed into information. This focused term gives particular meaning to the phrase access to information that to this day dominates the profession's thinking and imposes boundaries on its intellectual sandbox. But the American Public Library is a unique civic institution because, unlike many other civic institutions, the courts, schools, for example, people don't have to use it. As a result, over the generations, users heavily influenced the process of shaping public library collections and services. Librarianship's discourse, however, does not address in any direct way this kind of bottom-up pressure, and for me was not comprehensive enough to explain what I was discovering about library as place and the transformative power of stories users withdrew from libraries over the generations. So to explain my findings, my challenge became how to expand beyond the professional discourse, how to see outside the boundary of my profession's limited sandbox of ideas, how to craft a framework that accommodated and explained the voices of library users I was uncovering in my research. In the 1930s, at the Atlanta Public Library's African American branch, one of the few places in the city where blacks felt safe and welcome, Director Annie Waters secured a grant to fund adult education programs, including discussion groups focused on Mahatma Gandhi. To ground these discussions, Waters purchased a number of books. Among the most devoted readers was a young Martin Luther King Jr., who came to the library many times during the week, Waters said. She later recalled their interactions, which not only showed King's reading interests, but also manifested the value of library as place to Atlanta's black community. He'd walk up to the desk and look me straight in the eye. "Hello, Martin Luther," she would respond, always calling him by his first and middle names. "What's on your mind?" "Oh, nothing particularly." For Waters, that was a cue that King had learned a new big word, and between them they then had a conversation in which King used the word repeatedly, and Waters corrected him when he used it incorrectly. Another game they played involved poetry. Again, King would stand by the desk, waiting. "What's on your mind, Martin Luther?" Waters would ask. "For I dipped into the future far as the human eye could see," he responded. Waters immediately recognized the Tennyson poem and finished the verse, saw a vision of the world and all the wonder that would be. The Gandhi collection presented a problem, however, because King was too young to check out adult books on his children's card. To solve it, Waters told him, "Ask your father to come and get a library card and I'll check the books out on that." And that's how I made it possible, Waters said, for Martin Luther to read those books on Gandhi. And he read every one of the books that we had. There we go. On a District of Columbia library branch in one of Washington's poorest neighborhoods. In it, we reported that every Tuesday night, a homeless man named Conrad Cheek entered the library and set up his chessboard on one of the tables in the children's room. We immediately noticed the transformation taking place. No more ignored pleas for this homeless man, no averted glances. During the next hour, people will look him in the eye. They'll listen to his words. In this down at the Heels library, he's a teacher. Among his students was 9-year-old Allie Osman. As we watched this interaction, Allie's mother explained that her son's confidence had soared after playing with Conrad, that he was now bragging to friends about being a chess player. "We owe it all to Mr. Conrad," his mother said. "We love him. Inside the library," we reported, they call him Mr. Conrad. Notice, all these very meaningful experiences occurred in a place we call library. To categorize them as information gathering fails to capture their significance in the lives of each of these individuals. In a 2008 interview, 88-year-old Pete Seeger recalled an early life reading experience. At age 7, a librarian recommended me a book about a teenager who runs away from his stepfather, who's beating him, and is adopted by a middle-aged Indian whose tribe was massacred and whose wife was sold into slavery and is living alone. That he remembered this so vividly 80 years after reading it is testimony to the power of stories, and in Seeger's case, a New York Times editor noted upon his death several years ago, fitting for someone who went on to engage issues of conscience. In 1984, President Ronald Reagan wrote the daughter-in-law of Harold Bell Wright, whose best-selling 1920s religious novel, That Printer of Udell's, Reagan had read as an adolescent in Dixon, Illinois. Wright was no favorite of contemporary literary critics. H.L. Mencken called him a liberated yokel from the hog and cow states. No matter to young Reagan, however. Shortly after reading the book, he declared himself saved and was baptized. The novel's protagonist, Reagan wrote Wright's daughter-in-law 60 years later, served as a role model that shaped his life ever since. It's highly likely the copy of That Printer of Udell's Reagan read came from the Dixon Public Library, which he visited twice a week in the early 1920s, mostly to check out Frank Merriweather and Sherlock Holmes stories, Tarzan novels, and books by Horatio Alger, Zane Grey, and Mark Twain, many of which he read on the library's front steps. "I'm a sucker for hero worship," he later admitted. For Oprah Winfrey, reading commonplace stories was an open door for freedom in my life and allowed me to see that there was a world beyond my grandmother's front porch in Mississippi, that everybody didn't have an outhouse, that everybody wasn't surrounded by poverty, that there was a hopeful world out there and it could belong to me. To Winfrey, the stories became her comfort, her solace to commune with and learn something about myself, to learn something about other people, to learn something about the world. In a small Milwaukee apartment as a 9-year-old in 1963, she read a public library copy of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, her first all-night book, the story of Francie Nolan, whose life was full of humiliation and whose only friends were in books lining the public library shelf. I felt like my life was hers. After her father died in 1963, 9-year-old Sonia Sotomayor buried herself in reading at her Bronx library and the apartment she shared with her mother and brother. Nancy Drew had a powerful hold on my imagination, she remembered. Every night when I'd finished reading and got into bed and closed my eyes, I'd continue the story with me in Nancy's shoes until I fell asleep. Her mind, she noted, worked in ways very similar to Nancy's. I was a keen observer and listener. I picked up on clues, I figured things out logically, and I enjoyed puzzles. I loved the clear, focused feeling that came when I concentrated on solving the problem and everything else faded out. Her reading that summer, she admitted, was her solace and only distraction that got her through this time of trouble. All these anecdotes point to the power of printed commonplace stories to change people's lives. But stories reside in all cultural media. If you watch television, go to the movies, read popular magazines, and look at advertisements, notes Richard Keller Simon, you're exposed to many of the same kinds of stories as someone who studies the great books of Western civilization. You simply have been encouraged to look at them differently. Stories, Richard Nash argues, constitute recipes for the imagination. Although most American public libraries had Nancy Drew on their shelves in 1963, the New York Public Library did not. There, librarians considered series fiction trash. Instead, Sonia Sotomayor got her copies of Nancy from her mother for good behavior. The New York Public Library did not drop the ban on Nancy until 1976. The San Francisco Public Library did not drop the ban until 1996. Then there were the pulp paperback titles from the 1950s and 60s that many gays and lesbians read voraciously and considered survival literature. They were never acquired by public libraries. What public libraries often gave them instead was misinformation. Because she believed libraries are the place where we can be most anonymous and delve deeply into areas we wish to uncover in secret, one 15-year-old later recalled, it was to the library I turned in 1969 to uncover the meaning of my lesbianism, and what I found was not echoic of my own experience. Rather, those books frightened me and convinced me that this was not lesbianism I was experiencing, but something else. Although public libraries cannot be all things to all people, part of our lives shows they've been more things to more people than most cultural authorities, including many librarians, have realized. I bring this to your attention today because I think American public libraries have opportunities to exploit possibilities made visible in part of our lives by stepping outside the conventional sandbox of ideas. So here's the part about broadening your thinking about libraries in general and what public libraries accomplish for their users in particular. The research I did for part of our lives convinces me that people love their public libraries not only for access to information, but also for the places they make available, and the commonplace reading materials they supply. Our ability to understand the importance of the latter two in everyday lives of public library users is, however, greatly limited by the professional discourse librarians have inherited from previous generations, one that was already evident in the first order Benjamin Franklin submitted to a London bookseller in 1732 for the new Library Company of Philadelphia that he and others started. For example, it listed no fiction. Filled instead with dictionaries, grammars, and atlas, histories, and books on science and agriculture, one historian noted, the 46 titles were suited to the tastes and purses of young tradesmen. In other words, Franklin wanted his library company to nurture the self-made man his Poor Richard's Almanac celebrated. As he saw it, fiction had no role in that process. By privileging useful knowledge, by prioritizing information above stories, Franklin unknowingly reinforced a discourse librarianship has followed to the present day. But that discourse overlooks and undervalues some pretty impressive community roles that are reflected in public library statistics. Remember back in the 1980s when many evangelists of information technology predicted the demise of public libraries by the turn of the century? They were wrong, dead wrong. In 2016, which is the latest year for which we have statistics, the U.S. has more public libraries than ever, 17,219, including branches and bookmobiles. That's more than Starbucks and 3,000 more than McDonald's restaurants. And while public libraries provided users with access to 250,000 internet-ready computers, 100% more per capita than a decade earlier, equally impressive were statistics addressing library as place and the circulation of commonplace reading. In 2016, the number of visits, 1.5 billion, represented an increase of 21% over the previous decade and totals more than the combined attendance of all Major League Baseball and National Basketball Association games. In 2016, 93 million Americans attended a public library program, an 8-year increase of 38%. 65 million attendees were children, a 24% increase from the previous decade. In 2016, public libraries circulated 2.2 billion items, including audio and video materials and ebooks, a 28% increase from 2006. Circulation per capita showed a 10-year increase of 17%. To understand what these statistics mean in the everyday lives of public library users, let me cite Susan Pinker's recently published book, The Village Effect: How Face-to-Face Contact Can Make Us Healthier, Happier, and Smarter. In it, she harnesses research in the fast-developing field of social neuroscience to demonstrate that substantial benefits accrue to those who experience high levels of face-to-face contact, including improved vocabularies, an increased ability to empathize, a deeper sense of belonging, and perhaps most important, a longer lifespan. As I pondered her conclusions, a compelling question flashed into my mind. What if the face-to-face contact public libraries make possible in so many ways enables users to live longer, happier, and healthier lives than non-users? And if we find out that public library users do live longer, happier, and healthier lives, what are the reasons that this is happening? To answer questions like these, we have to expand our traditional focus beyond access to information in order to include, analyze, and assess the community building benefits of the public library as a place and the positive effects of the sociability that reading, viewing, and listening fosters through the materials it circulates. Library as place. What you see here is the lobby of the Toledo-Lucas County, Ohio Public Library the night that a new Harry Potter novel was introduced. And I want you to look at the faces in that audience. They represent many ethnicities, races, gender, ages, etc. Only in recent years has the library profession even begun counting on a national level the number of people attending library programs. Same for listing library exhibits in public library space. And only recently have researchers surveyed as consumers of library space to determine perceived need. At the same time, however, my colleagues doing library research have seldom attempted to measure how library spaces function as agents in the interactions of public library users as individuals or as members of larger groups in order to see what and how much they learned. Yet, from a library in the life of the user perspective, knowing how and why patrons use library space and what they learn there, formally and informally, is essential to understanding why Americans love their public libraries and perhaps help them lead longer, happier, and healthier lives. To explore in part of our lives how people benefited from the American Public Library as place, I adopted the vocabulary of public sphere literature and used words and phrases like public interest, exchange social capital, participatory culture, and civic commons to explain user behaviors. It's easy to see the public library as a player in this theoretical framework. Generations of users demonstrated they valued the public library as a place by voluntarily visiting it again and again. Let me cite one example of common effect of visiting a public library. For many Americans, it constituted the first place in the public sphere where they enjoyed adult privileges, and by obtaining a public library card as a child, formally accepted a civic responsibility to respect public property. That sense of responsibility does not go away very easily. One of Captain Chesley Sully Sullenberger's concerns after he landed U.S. Airways Flight 1549 in New York's Hudson River on January 15, 2009, was a Contra Costa Public Library book he had aboard his plane. It might come back late, he told the library, perhaps even a little water damaged. Public sphere literature certainly helped me explain why people have historically loved their public libraries. And now there's some contemporary research that shows public library users actually are happier people. In March 2014, Pew Research released a study that demonstrated the more people are engaged with their public library, the more they felt connected to their community as a whole. Public library users are more likely to say that they like their communities and they would call their communities good or excellent places to live, said a Pew Research associate. If we move the questions about personal happiness that the public library as place brings to its users closer to the center of our thinking, I'm convinced we'll generate a lot of answers to the critics who now think library buildings are mere brick and mortar dinosaurs. Same with reading commonplace fiction. This is your awe moment. That's a photo of my son Andy with my grandson Teague. Teague's fully capable of reading that book, but he wants that book read by his dad. Social neuroscientists now call this dialogic reading. Recent neuroscientific search on reading has demonstrated how narrative activates particular parts of the brain, including the sensory and motor cortexes. The brain, it seems, does not make much of a distinction between reading about an experience and encountering it in real life, Anne Murphy Paul notes. In each case, the same neurological regions are stimulated. One researcher found that fiction offered readers the opportunity to enter fully into other people's thoughts and feelings. Another saw a substantial overlap in the brain networks used to understand stories and the networks used to navigate interactions with other individuals, in particular, interactions in which we're trying to figure out the thoughts and feelings of others. Fiction, notes psychologist Keith Oatley, is a particularly useful simulation because negotiating the social world effectively is extremely tricky, requiring us to weigh up myriad interacting instances of cause and effect. Just as computer simulations can help us come to grips with complex scientific problems, so novels, stories, and dramas can help us understand the complexities of social life. That public libraries have always played a primary role in making stories accessible in millions of users is pretty obvious and resonates in the words of Maria, Pete Seeger, Ronald Reagan, Oprah Winfrey, Sonia Sotomayor, and Danny. Ever since the Boston Public Library opened in 1854, fiction consistently averaged 66 to 75% of public library circulation. By force of demand, then, every generation of public library users has insisted on a set of stories acceptable to a majority of community members that contain messages they wanted to read, hear, and view. Circulation statistics I cited previously show they still do. Perhaps, since the middle of the 19th century, library and government officials have argued that the public library's most important role is to provide access to useful information that develops intelligent consumers, creative entrepreneurs, and informed citizens, the kind of information Thomas Edison pursued in his public library that many argue people can now retrieve on their computers at home. But part of our lives demonstrates that public library users have historically shown a different set of priorities. For them, the tens of thousands of spaces public libraries provided for many purposes, and the billions of commonplace stories they circulated in a variety of textual forms were at least as important, perhaps even more important, than access to information, and for a variety of reasons. For generations now, adolescent series fiction, adult Western, romance, horror, mystery, and science fiction novels have driven public library circulation. They still do. Through commonplace stories like these that they circulated by the billions, American public libraries have helped empower, inform, intellectually stimulate, and inspire their readers, viewers, and listeners, just like Pete Seeger, Ronald Reagan, Oprah Winfrey, and Sonia Sotomayor. And through the tens of thousands of spaces they made available to their patrons, public libraries have helped construct community in multiple positive ways through the billions of face-to-face encounters they nurtured, just like they did for Martin Luther King Jr. and Conrad Cheek. In my lifetime of research into American library history, I've read thousands of statements like, public libraries are not just warehouses of books anymore. If part of our lives accurately represents public library history, they never were. Yet, for effect and contrast, journalists often parroted and reinforced this myth by drawing on these stereotypes and on their own limited public library experiences. If I had $1 for every time I came across this kind of statement in my research, I'd probably make more than the royalties this book will generate. Part of our lives proves to my satisfaction that public libraries are so much more than information. In addition to providing access to information, for the past century and a half, they've been public places of performance where users displayed moral progress and achievement. They've also operated as a robust commons where members of the public discussed a variety of issues that concerned them. They've functioned as centripetal forces to craft a sense of community, local, state, and national, among disparate populations and evolve community trust between its multicultural elements. They've acted as key players in constructing group identity through the stories and places they provided. And they started neighborhood conversations, welcomed the recently arrived into their midst, and served as community anchors. Access to information, library's place, and the transformative potential of reading commonplace stories. I hope conclusions I've drawn from my historical research have encouraged you to broaden your thinking about libraries in general and public libraries in particular. The naysayers largely ignorant of this library history are still with us. It's all on the internet, hype many evangelists of information technology. Libraries are dinosaurs, grouse officials looking to cut budgets. I agree here that to combat this limited thinking, we have to extend our scope of analysis beyond information access to include, from the user's perspective, deeper analysis of library's place and the role of commonplace stories. By doing so, my historical research strongly suggests we can document hundreds, if not thousands more ways these incubators of personal happiness and informal self-education contribute to the daily lives of our patrons as individuals and as members of their community. And we can show much more clearly how they function as active and effective agents in the construction of that very community. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Dr. Wiegand has offered to answer a couple of questions, but in preparing for tonight's program, I did some research, and I came across a fascinating book that he co-wrote with his wife called Books on Trial about the Oklahoma Four, and I'd like him to take a moment to tell the story behind that book.
Okay. One day in the late 1990s, I don't talk much. My friends at Rossmore know that I don't talk very much, so bear with me. Oh, sorry. All right. One day in the late 1990s, I came across an article in a library periodical about a bookstore in Oklahoma City that had its entire collection confiscated by the local authorities, and the owners of the bookstore put on trial for what was in the books. It came shortly before the United States entered World War II, at a time when their anti-communist feeling was running very high. Well, Cheryl and I decided to go ahead and write the article, but when we found the transcripts of the trials in the Oklahoma Department of History and Archives, that stood that high, we had a story to tell. So we did. We told that story. But the background for this, and the book was published in 2007 or 2008, I can't remember. The background for this is Cheryl was on the faculty at the University of Oklahoma Law School at the same time Anita Hill was there. And as they became fast friends, such that when Anita went to Washington to testify in the Clarence Thomas hearings, Cheryl went with her. When they returned to Oklahoma, local politicians eviscerated Anita and Cheryl. And among the mediums that was most critical was the Oklahoma City's daily newspaper, the Daily Oklahoman. It left scars, as you might imagine. After we finished the book and it was published, our publisher got us a venue in 2008 for the First Amendment seminar that the Daily Oklahoman, that very newspaper, sponsors every year. The Daily Oklahoman had not remembered its own evisceration of my wife, so we were very proud to stand up and bear witness to how awful the Daily Oklahoman was to those four people who had been unjustifiably imprisoned and persecuted in the 1940s, excuse me. But I want to take a poll, and Adrian, you can report this back to Cheryl. As we wrote this book, and I was the one that did the first draft, and it was like 9 o'clock at night, and I'd been working since 8 o'clock in the morning, and a rush of inspiration came to me, and I put this sentence into the manuscript. From the hustings, Reverend Harvey Hectored. I thought, is that brilliant or what? Well, guess who red penned the thing out of there? Next draft, I stuck it back in there. Red and penned it again. It never did make the final, but I'm going to poll you. How many of you think from the hustings, Reverend Harvey Hectored is a brilliant line? Adrian, you can report back. Only one person raised that. So I guess she was smarter than I was.
Any questions for Dr. Wiegand? Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Carnegie Libraries and
Yeah.
the history of that?
Right.
I'm going to repeat this for the taping. Could he comment on the history of the Carnegie Libraries?
Right. Well, you know Carnegie made his millions. Oh, sorry. Carnegie made his millions on the backs of lower class people, many of them immigrants. And there was violence and there was bloodshed at some of those steel mills. When he finally, quote unquote, retired, he decided to give his money away. And among the chief beneficiaries of those were communities across the country. 1,600 communities received a building grant. Now, what people don't know very much about these buildings, and I'll bet many of you spent childhood in Carnegie libraries. What people don't know is communities would apply for a grant. Carnegie's minions would say, okay, how many people do you have? Are there any social libraries that you're going to absorb into your public library collections? And based on a formula, they would then come up with the amount of money that community could get. So the communities would get $10,000 to put up a building. Well, the communities knew nothing about how to build a library, so they'd write back to Carnegie by the hundreds. Finally, Carnegie said, let's make 6 prototypical styles, one for the small public library, the medium-sized public library, et cetera, the large library. And that's why most of those Carnegie libraries are so similar. Of course, they also bought the same furniture, so that was also part of it. But in those 6 prototypical architectural buildings, every single one of them included a community room, okay? Library as place. And as I traced through the history of public libraries, they had sewing classes in the 1990s in Minnesota. They had health fairs. Almost everything that we do today in a public library, absent the newer technologies, they did in the 1890s and the 1900s. So library as place is a tradition. It is not something new. It's always been there. Now, librarians were very good at building collections. And in many cases, by the time you got to go to a Carnegie library, those librarians had taken over that community room with more books. So you didn't see it as much. And that's probably why we in I shouldn't say we, that's probably why my colleagues in librarianship think library as community place is something new. It ain't.
Dr. Wiegand is a prolific writer. He also wrote a book called Irrepressible Reformer about Melville Dewey of the famous Dewey Decimal System, and he was quite an interesting man. I wondered if you'd comment on him for a bit.
Right. Mine was the 4th biography of Melville Dewey. The previous 3 painted halos on the guy. Anyone who knows me realizes when I do history research, I don't find halos all the time. When they're there, I paint them, but I also find warts. And it so happens that this man who invented the Dewey Decimal Classification System with a variety of other endeavors, including owning the place that peddled the library furniture to those Carnegie buildings, also was an anti-Semite, a racial bigot, and a sexual harasser. The book was published in 1996 by the American Library Association, and it wasn't until last year that the American Library Association got around to dropping the name of the Melville Dewey Award. Did you want more information? You want me to get into detail?
That was the stuff that jumped out at me. Any other questions for Dr. Wiegand? Well, please join me in thanking him, and books will be for sale and signing out in the lobby.